everybody, Amy Osborne here, talking today about leaky gut. If you follow my blog, perhaps you read my latest post about leaky gut or increased intestinal permeability. And if you did, this will hopefully give you a little bit of clarification, give you some kind of visual aids about what exactly is going on. And if you didn't read it, it's also going to give you some really basic information about what leaky gut is. So forgive my artistic abilities or lack thereof, but this is supposed to show the lining of your GI tract. So we have simple columnar epithelium, and if you don't really remember what that means from high school biology, it just means that we have a single layer of cells in our small intestine, which really helps for nutrients to be absorbed. And those cells have these little projections called villi, and off of the villi are microvilli. So it's almost like we've got these finger projections, and then there's almost hairs going off of them. And the more surface area we have, the higher chances there are of nutrients actually being absorbed. Well, what happens in leaky gut is that a protein called zonulin is released, and zonulin comes in and actually breaks these tight junctions between the cells. And what that allows is food, undigested food, and toxins, and even bacteria in our gut to get absorbed into our blood. Now, normally in a healthy gut, certain things are transported through. That's a lot more complex than we're going to go into. So there are transport proteins that will pump things through. Some things go through via osmosis or even diffusion. But the point is that our body is a really regulated system, and it's really good at keeping things out that need to be kept out, so kept out of the blood, and able to absorb the things that it needs to. But in the case of leaky gut, now we have these openings and opportunities for things like bacteria and food particles to get in. Well, when those unwanted items or particles are actually being absorbed into your blood, you're going to have an autoimmune response to it, more or less, right? So we're going to have antibodies are released, and they're going to attack those things because they're foreign particles. Now, if you're somebody that eats something repeatedly, sometimes that can actually trigger an ultimate sensitivity or intolerance to something because you're getting repeated exposure to it. Your body really starts to release those antibodies anytime you eat it. So one of the reasons that I always like to bring this up to people is that oftentimes people will feel like they get really sluggish after they eat something. Maybe they're really sluggish after their afternoon meal, and sometimes we attribute that to like an insulin crash if you ate something high in sugar. But what if you're eating a relatively clean diet and you're still having things like gas or indigestion or diarrhea, or again, things like fatigue or even headaches after certain foods? There is a high chance that you've got some leaky gut stuff going on. Similarly, if you've got skin issues, that can be related to our bodies really releasing those antibodies in response to those foods because they're getting absorbed into our blood. So if you don't really know what you're sensitive to, it's really hard unless you do an elimination diet or really go see somebody that specializes in that. But I really, really encourage people to take a really long, hard look at their diet, especially if it's pretty healthy. If you're thinking to yourself, gosh, I don't eat a lot of sugar, I certainly don't eat gluten or dairy or things that can be inflammatory in nature, really take a peek into this and consider that this might be what's going on. Now, one thing that's worth noting is that, of course, this heals just like other tissue in our body, but we have to give it the perfect environment to heal. So we want to make sure that we're eliminating things that are inflammatory in nature. I know that myself personally, when I did some food sensitivity testing, I was really sensitive to tomatoes. And so the more I ate tomatoes, the more inflammation that there was, and these tight junctions weren't really allowed to heal. So figuring out what you're sensitive to and then eliminating those is really key. Now, stress is another thing that we really have to be mindful of, because the more stress we have, the more inflammation we have because of cortisol. So again, those tight junctions can't heal. And then one thing to really keep in mind is the role of gluten. So research has shown that zonulin, that protein that comes in and breaks those tight junctions, that comes in and breaks these and causes these areas of leak in our gut. Zonulin is released in response to gluten. The only other thing that's released in response to is bacteria. So if we have kind of a microbiome that's not super healthy, overgrowth of certain bad bacteria, which is what the case is in SIBO, which is small intestine bacterial overgrowth. Or even if you're just not eating a lot of foods with probiotics in them, when we kind of have an imbalance of good to bad bacteria. So those are two things that we absolutely have to consider as well when we're looking at healing the gut. Obviously, it's a lot more complex than that, but sometimes it's really nice to get that visual of, what does it really mean to have leaky gut and why does it matter? Of course, it matters because we're having an inflammatory response in our body, and so that's going to be systemic. Once we get that inflammation in our bloodstream, there's going to be other health consequences. And even if you're not having symptoms, another thing that can develop are nutrient deficiencies, right? So with leaky gut, we can have damage to these microvilli, and then maybe you have less absorptive area, surface area, and you can't absorb nutrients as well, which was definitely the case with me personally. I had no idea that I had leaky gut. I had very minimal symptoms, but was really depleted in several nutrients despite the fact that I was eating a pretty nutrient-rich diet. It was that my body couldn't actually absorb those nutrients. So I know that this is kind of a time of year for a lot of people where we're cutting things out, and maybe that's driven more by weight, but really take a look at what your health looks like. Maybe a week's worth of journaling and being mindful of how you feel after you eat would shed some insight into whether or not maybe you have some of these symptoms. And perhaps you don't, but I just wanted to educate you and give you a little bit of information about this so that you can continue to pursue your healthiest life. Thanks so much for watching.